In this video, I'm going to talk about the towball mass trick with tandem trailers, which is particularly important if you are considering buying a tandem or triple axle trailer, but also of interest if you already own one. Let's start off with how tandem trailers should work, then we'll look at how maybe they're not working. So we have a front axle and we have a rear axle, and then we have a counterbalancing force over there. It's called a towball mass. It's not really a towball mass, but we'll call it that because that's the popular term for it. Now we're going to represent the weight on this axle with that red arrow, and the weight on that axle, rear axle, with another red arrow, and then the towball mass is at the front. Now we've got here equal weight on the front axle and the rear axle, and that means equal grip on the front and the rear axle. The more load you put on the tyre, the more grip you have on that tyre, more weight on it, and conversely, the less weight, the less load, the less grip you have on that tyre. And what that means is when we've got pretty much equal, we have maximum stability when towing, both in pitching and in yawing, and just generally that's what you want to aim for maximum stability, which is after all part of the reason you bought or will buy a tandem trailer. Now what I should say is that whilst I've represented this perfectly, as in exactly the same amount of weight front and rear, there's always going to be some variation. It's the degree of variation which is the problem. Now what happens if we make this front and rear axle load uneven? We put way more weight on the front axle than the rear axle. Well, we have unequal grip, and then that means that we have a loss of stability. And we can actually have this unequal grip and yet have the towball mass perfectly within whatever limits you think is appropriate. So the nature of the front rear load balance is not necessarily going to affect the towball mass. So don't look at the towball mass and say, okay, that is perfect, that's within limits, therefore the front and rear load split between those two axles must be good. So here's the problems. We get compromised stability, and we also have the potential to overload usually the front axle because it's taking way more weight than the rear axle. And remember, tandem axle caravans are built to within some extent to have equal weight front and rear. So when you've got a lot more weight on the front, that could overload the axle and the tyre, which is obviously not ideal, potentially leading to premature failure. So let's now talk about how towball mass works. We're going to start off with a single axle trailer because it's easier to conceptualise. 2.5 tonne trailer weight. And what we do is we put a line down the centre connecting to the axle, and then we have a centre of gravity, which is in effect where the trailer will balance, and then we look at that distance over here. We call that 400 millimetres, and then we measure from that axle centre line or the pivot point to the tow hitch, and we find that is 4 metres. Okay, now what do we do with that? Well, we multiply that 2500 by 400 mil and we come out with 1 million. Now don't worry about what that million means, it's just a number which we're going to use to find how much the towball mass is. So we take that million, we divide it by that 4 metres, and we come up with 250 kilograms, and that is our towball mass. Now here's how it works if you lengthen the drawbar. So this is a bonus point. Apart from talking about tandem trailers, we're going to talk about the effect of longer drawbars. So we take our 2500 by 400, that hasn't changed, assuming the centre of gravity is the same. Now in practice it won't be because we've got a little bit more weight there, but conceptually it certainly does work. We come out to 1 million again, but this time we've increased the length of the drawbar to 4,500, 4.5 metres, and we divide our million by that, and we only have 222 kilograms. So the longer the drawbar you have, assuming the centre of gravity stays in the same place, then the less towball mass and the more stable it is. So that's the concept to remember, and we've just done it with a single axle trailer because it's easier. Now let's take a look at tandem trailers and bring that into it. So for a single trailer, the pivot point is going to be in line with the axle, exactly halfway through the wheel. For a tandem, what it should be is halfway between the two wheels, or the axle group as it's known. That's where it should be. Now, might not be exactly there, but in a perfect world, that is where it would be. Right, now we're going to talk about load share, non-load share suspension. I know this seems a little bit off topic, and I could just get straight to the advice, and you can skip to the end of the video if you want that, but I like to be able to explain how and why I got to the particular bits of advice that I'm using, and I have to go through load sharing suspension. So this is a non-load share system. So what that means is when it goes over a bump, this wheel will take all of the weight, and it completely is unaffected by what's happening with that wheel, and vice versa. So this is compressed. That one might drop down a bit because the spring will obviously extend a bit, but there's no relationship between the front axle and the rear axle. Now, for load share system, that works a bit differently. So we've got here a sort of semi-axle, and then there's a pivot point, and we've got our springs here and here. When this goes over a bump, you can see that this wheel is forced up, that wheel is forced down, and I put the arrows there to demonstrate it. So that is forcing these wheels to stay in contact with the ground, which is obviously good for stability, particularly off-road. But it also means that our pivot point is always going to be pretty much in the center of those two axles, whereas with this system it can start to vary more than what you find with a load share system. And the problem I'm talking about here is primarily, almost exclusively, with non-load share systems, which are quite common. And this is what a non-load share system typically looks like underneath a caravan. Those are the springs. There's a shock absorber here, there's another one there. This moves up and down, that moves up and down. There is no connection between the front wheel and the rear wheel whatsoever, hence that's not a load sharing system. So what happens? Now, having spoken to quite a number of mobile way operators and owners of caravans, here's what I think is going on. A caravan manufacturer will buy an off-the-shelf chassis, which nothing wrong in that. It's a good idea to use specialised components from specialised manufacturers and put it all together. That's just how modern industry works. It's a well-proven technique. You certainly don't want to be custom building absolutely everything yourself, so nothing wrong in that. So having got the body, the chassis, they then put their body on top. They go, well, here's where we're going to put the toilet, here's where the main body's going to go, the bed, etc. and so forth, and they do the calculations, figure it all out. Again, nothing wrong with that. This is where I think the problem comes in. It's when customizations start to happen, and if you request customizations from a caravan maker, this is where you'd start to need to be very careful indeed. And the reason is that when you start asking for things like extra toolboxes, bike carriers, extra water tanks, etc., it seems that the caravan manufacturers don't always do the calculations to figure out how much extra weight is going to be added to the caravan, or the weight distribution, which can lead to the towball mass being out of limits. And it's certainly not unusual for people to find, even without customizations, a caravan is way heavier than what they thought it would be, and with customizations even more. So that is definitely something to be concerned about. So here's how it might work. So you've built your caravan, and you know someone's going to tow it with, let's say, 300 series or something like that, and you discover that it's actually a 390 kilogram towball mass, which is out of limits and more than what you told the customer. So you've got two choices at that point. One is you can redesign the caravan and shift things around to bring the weight back into limits, or you can play around with the towball mass and the front and rear axle loads, and this is how it's done. So essentially here you see we've got the centre of gravity, that's not going to change, and we've got the pivot point there. We need to bring the pivot point forwards, and what we do is we simply shift that pivot point from about there to there. And what that happens is that we just simply make the front axle take more load than the rear axle, and that's evidenced by the longer arrow I've got here versus that one, and the rear one takes less load in this example compared to the original, and that will actually decrease the towball mass. But as I've explained earlier on, this imbalance between, a huge imbalance between front and rear axle loads, is not good for stability or longevity of the caravan. So that might bring the towball mass down to, let's say, 320, which is within your 350 limits, which is what you told the customer. Here's the calculation. So we've got a 3.5 ton trailer, and we have a distance between the pivot point and the centre of gravity of 500 mil, and we multiplied it out 1.75 million. So far so good. We then take that and we divide that by the distance between the pivot point and the hitch, 4,500 mil, and we come out with 390 kilograms of towball mass. Okay, that's too much. What do? We shifted that pivot point forwards. Now we've got a distance of 400 mil between the pivot point and the centre of gravity. So that's 3,500 times 400, 1.4. We divide that by the new distance here of 4,400 and we come up with 320, which is now within limits. So what we've done is we've just reduced the toe ball mass, and that looks good on paper, until you realise, of course, that we've now got way more load on the front than the rear. Now, exactly how much load is going to depend on the suspension and a whole bunch of other things there, but that's the sort of playing around. And as I said, you want to aim for approximately equal between those two and not artificially move things forward just to get a toe ball mass within limits. The correct way to get the toe ball mass back within limits is to take your weight and move it from the front, preferably as central as possible. That is the correct way to do it, not play around with toe ball mass. So how is that actually done if you're not going to shift weight around? Well, there's a few different ways. One is you can, probably the least effective way but might work a little bit, is to massively increase tyre pressure on this axle and then reduce it on that axle. Another way to do it, so you've got air suspension, is to increase the stiffness of the air suspension on the front axle and reduce it on the rear axle. That also have the same effect. And this has also been reported to me. You can simply fit stiffer or longer springs in the front and or softer and shorter springs in the rear, all of which have the same effect of playing around with that pivot point and therefore shifting the toe ball mass, as opposed to redistributing weight to get the toe ball mass within limits. Okay, now I'm going to demonstrate how this works using a brooder. Now I want to make it very clear, I've got a lot of time for brooder caravans. They've got a really good air suspension load share system, and that works very well indeed. But one of the really cool side effects of it is that I can actually demonstrate how this system works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the air spring pressure here and reduce it here, and then you'll see that the toe ball mass will reduce almost to nothing. So that's kind of a practical demonstration of what I'm talking about, and brooder can do that, but generally you'd run it in their really good load sharing configuration. Now you can see here that's airbag is fully inflated, and this one looks pretty miserable because there's basically no air in it. So that's the difference. So you can also have a look at that. The tyres were pretty much the same pressure, so the contact patch on that's much greater because there's all the weight on it, whereas on the rear tyre there's virtually no weight on that. Not suggesting you necessarily want to run that, but you know, it is good to have the flexibility to shift your weight forwards or shift your pivot point forwards or backwards. Okay, that's about done now. So you can see that I can even just do it one-handed because I have changed the toe ball mass simply by shifting the pivot point from about here to pretty much over the axles. So how's that trick with the toe ball mass working? Well, we've got load sharing suspension in at the moment, and so we've got the centre of gravity which is arbitrarily about there, and our pivot point and the load sharing system is halfway between the two wheels, and therefore then we've got this distance between that pivot point and the centre of gravity, and that will then give us a certain amount of toe ball mass at the front. Then what we do, we massively front bias the pivot point. So in other words, we're basically just shifting this pivot point from the centre to the front, and in that distance from pivot point to the centre of gravity is less, so we've got a smaller centre of gravity, toe ball mass at the front. Or we could do it the other way around. We could almost in effect lift this wheel completely off the air, move the pivot point back here, then this arrow would be much larger and we get a much greater toe ball mass. So you can play around with things in that way depending on what your needs are. Now, if you're off-road, that can be a real bonus as well. Let's say you need to pivot the vehicle around on two wheels only, then you've pretty much got these wheels more or less in the air, not creating a lot of drag. So then in an off-road situation, you could pivot around the front wheels easily, whereas if you didn't have that capability, trying to do a 180 turn with these wheels dragging would be very, very difficult. So whilst this is a tandem trailer, you are somewhat negating one of the disadvantages of that tandem trailer design by the ability to turn more tightly should you need to do it. Now, of course, you're not necessarily going to go to all that trouble every single time you want to make a turn off-road, but there will be situations where you do want it, and it's nice to have that flexibility. Okay, so that was the demo. So again, we increased pressure on the airbag there, reduced it there, and then pivot point might have been about central. That was, let's say, approximately where the centre of gravity is, and we just shifted that forwards a bit to pretty much over the top, so it's kind of balancing almost on that wheel, and that is the way that works. So how do you know if your tandem trailer actually has a problem with this? Well, the only way to know is that you have to put it on the scales and weigh it, and have to be individual scales as well. So I would set the tyre pressure to be the same on all four wheels, and then I would weigh it hitched and unhitched, because when it's hitched it will be slightly level or non-level, and that will make a slight difference. Then you know you will not get exactly the same weight on the front and the rear axle, and that's fine. There are always tolerances. This, once you start getting into the detail there, suspension compression, tyre compression and all sorts of other things, it's not a problem if it's let's say approximately 15% within each other. And I'm basing that on data I got from Towhead, who gave me over 330 data points of tandems they've weighed. We looked at that and we thought, okay, well, I think about 15% should pretty much work there. Where it becomes certainly a problem is if you've got 2 tons on the front axle and 1 ton on the rear axle, you know something dodgy is going on there, and you've potentially got a lack of stability. So if you are buying a new caravan, I would make it a condition before you hand over the final money that A, the total weight of the caravan is where you agreed it should be, and B, that there is a reasonable weight distribution between front and rear, and you can agree that with the caravan manufacturer. I say I need to do a bit more research, but I'm thinking that about 15% is going to be approximately round about what it should be. So I hope you found this video useful. If you've got any questions or any experience with this sort of stuff, please use the comment section, and thank you for watching.